Hello and welcome to Class 20 of History 1378. We're well on our way, not a whole lot left, talking about stuff that you're probably more familiar with, you've heard more about. So we'll keep going today. In the last few classes, we've talked about the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, which is, as important as ever. And then we started the other day talking about just the 1960s in general, and I'm going to continue doing that today. And as I've been saying, especially in the last few classes, the things we're talking about are really important and quite big. And you could spend, several lectures or even an entire class just talking about Vietnam or civil rights or the 60s or whatever. I've done that. In fact, I have classes on Vietnam and on the 1960s. But we can't do that here. We're trying to cover as much as we can to give you kind of highlights of American history, as it were, from the Civil War and Reconstruction period to the present. So we'll go through it quickly, but I have spent, I think, more time than usual on these kind of more contemporary topics. And I think a lot of that has to do just because of what we're, dealing with this year. And we're kind of seeing this, increased importance of studying civil rights and protests and the government and stuff like that. All right. So the other day I introduced the 60s, and I did it by talking about this issue of like how we learn about the 1960s. And I've done that a lot in this class. I think it's important to kind of understand how we learn about these particular things, not just what happened. And in the 60s, I think one of the important ways we've learned about things is through what I call the process of commodification, the way that people have taken these images and these sounds and these ideas about the 1960s and turned them into something that you could use to sell stuff on one hand. And I showed you the end of Easy Rider, and then those two commercials which played exactly off of it for Mercury Cougar and then for Benz, right? Much later. And the other point of commodification, which is really important, and we talked about this many times, and most recently with the beatniks, is it kind of depoliticizes things too. So if you focus on the 60s through this sense of nostalgia, the music and the imagery and the hippies and the tie-dyed t-shirts and the bell-bottom jeans and all that kind of stuff, you're not focusing on the political importance of that era. Just like with the beatniks, if you talk about, they wore all black and they, snapped their fingers and they read poems and they smoke weed, then you're losing sight of the political meaning of the hipsters in the 1950s. And so that's why I think commodification is important. And I was pointing out the other day that the commodification is kind of the counter position to that key theme of that era, which I described as questioning authority. And you could put that in many different ways. But in the 60s, what you saw on like so many levels, in so many areas, so many people who had essentially been raised, in this culture, this society, which said that you should, conform and you should defer, you should, obey, you should listen to people, you should listen to people who have authority over you, your teachers and professors and parents and priests and ministers and the senator and the mayor and the governor and the president and everybody else. And in the 60s, what you see is like a real challenge to that, because people are starting to say, hey, you know what, you guys don't always tell us the truth, and look at the world you're creating. And so we're no longer going to do that. We're going to kind of be out on our own. We're going to think for ourselves and act for ourselves and do things, that we think are right. So like, and the beatniks, we talked about that. And that's where you start to see, this fermenting, this bubbling up in the civil rights movement and other movements in the early 1960s. So we'll keep on that today. Let's see. Here it is. All right. So I started with this, the New York Questioning Authority, and that was, like I said, Easy Rider and the two commercials that came after it. And then I pointed out that there's something beyond that. That commodification is a way to depoliticize it. So what I want to talk about now is why the 60s is important, not just for these cultural aspects of it, the hippies and LSD and, sex and drugs and rock and roll and Woodstock and stuff like that, but why it's important really politically, and especially now because we keep going back and talking more and more about a lot of that history, especially in 2020. So one of the things that's really crucial when you start to talk about this is in the 1960s, you had the emergence of a political group called the New Left. Now, a couple times this semester, I've talked about the left and the right, and it's really it become harder in America, in American history classes, to talk about in American society, to talk about this, more recently, because the left has become kind of a caricature. We have people saying, the radical left, and, Joe Biden is part of the radical left and stuff like that. And so it's really hard to kind of get a handle on what it really means. In American history in the 20th century, the left generally meant people who were fairly radical. They might be socialists, they might be anarchists, they might be communists. There are not a huge number of them. More likely, they would be kind of fairly active and militant labor union people, peace activists, things like that. But there was always this left, and the left generally was anti-capitalist. That's the kind of one thing it had in common. That it thought that the American economic system wasn't working for everybody, that the political system was dominated by the wealthy. So you had this kind of traditional left. And the left was often kind of very supportive of the Soviet Union in the United States, and it's very small. So the new left came around in the 1950s and 1960s, and it changed that concept of the way to look at American society. And it still critiqued capitalism, but it also critiqued American institutions in a different way. And one of the key people in it was this little picture here is a guy named C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills was a professor of sociology. He was from Texas, but he taught at Columbia University in New York. He was a character. He used to ride his bike around campus. I think it was a Triumph. And he wrote several books, but maybe the most important was called The Power Elite. Now, in class, I would say, has anybody ever heard of the Power Elite? And it'd be kind of a trick question, because generally nobody would raise, his or her hand. And I would say, well, you should have, because it's like the first page in the book. So Power Elite's important. I think it's an important way to look at American society. What Wright Mills did was take apart the idea of American democracy. Everybody is born, especially in the post-World War II era, in the Cold War, this idea of democracy is really critical, right? The Soviet Union is trying to take over the world. The communists are trying to take over, and the United States is defending democracy all over the world. So even if you overthrow a government in Iran or in Guatemala, and you put these murderous juntas in charge, you're defending democracy according to this rhetoric. So what Wright Mills did in The Power Elite was say that the United States isn't run like a democratic society where everybody, kind of really participates in American decisions and American politics and American, community, that it's actually composed of different power groups, the power elite. And this is, of course, corporate America, right? The banks and the industries and the industrial leaders and things like that. The government, of course, is part of that, power elite. The military industrial complex, but it could also be like the educational system is part of it. Could be labor, big labor unions like the AFL-CIO could be part of it. And his argument is that these power elite make these decisions among themselves. And so the vast majority of people are kind of left out, and they are there to either just kind of accept decisions that are made by these power elite or to ratify them. And that was the kind of whole point of voting, right? You vote in order to give your approval, but you don't really decide what those votes are about, or you don't decide who is running. You don't really, that stuff is done at a different level. That's above the typical American pay grade to determine who's going to be the presidential nominee and things like that. And so a lot of young people, especially, read C. Wright Mills, a lot of his stuff, The Power Elite especially, and they began to rethink the way American society was developed. The whole kind of idea of conformity and how great, everything was. As I said a couple times ago, the American economy blew up in the 1940s, late 40s and 50s. It was immense. It was expansive. And so people made money. People could purchase things. Consumer society grew. People could buy cars. They could get houses. They could go on vacations and things like that. And so, that was kind of the basis, right, of this kind of conformist culture. But even in the 1950s, people started to question that, and far more so after that. And so this is when you have the emergence of the new left. People are reading Wright Mills, and they're looking at this society, and they're wondering if, it's really as great as they're told that it should be. And the idea that a lot of these people come up with, especially people who join a group called SDS. SDS is kind of along with SNCC, probably a little behind SNCC, the most important kind of student protest group of the 1960s. SDS stood for Students for a Democratic Society. was mostly on college campuses. There were chapters all over the United States. Many were quite big, very influential. SDS was, really important in that era, both in terms of developing programs to make the United States more democratic, and also later in fighting against the Vietnam War. And kind of the key element in what SDS came up with, which is kind of based on what it had read from C. Wright Mills and a lot of other people, and this is really crucial, is the idea of participatory democracy. That's crucial. In that entire decade, as much as anything, this is the theme that younger people, especially the people who are protesting, this is the theme that they talk about, and this is their goal. So it's a pretty basic idea. The United States has a democracy. Okay, what's that mean? Well, in general, and again, I go around class and ask people, and in general, people would say, first off, you have a right to vote, right? So you could go vote for the president or the governor or the mayor or whatever. And then people would talk about, free speech, you have a right to say what you want and things like that. And what Mills and SDS and a whole lot of other people who were critical of American society said was that level of democracy wasn't adequate. That in fact, the decisions were being made by a small number of people at a very high level, and that most people did not have a voice in making the decisions that they had to follow, the rules that they had to follow, the decisions that would basically control their lives. That, what you did was you went out and voted, or you did something every few years, and that was your participation. It was kind of indirect. You choose somebody else who will go to, to become your senator or governor or something like that. So what SDS said was that the United States needed a real democracy in which people participated at all levels. All right. So let me give you a few examples, because it's always easier to kind of figure out what it means rather than we, talking about this in kind of these esoteric or theoretical ways. So the SDS began became very popular. A lot of people are joining it. A lot of students are joining it. So they began creating these community projects, and they would send people out into cities all over, Baltimore, Louisville, Washington, D.C., New York, Columbus, Ohio. A lot of places would have SDS chapters. And they went out, they would send these groups of people out to work with people in the local community, people who were really still very far away from power. So as an example of that, they might go to a public housing project, right? A place where, it's really run down, or just a basic apartment project where you have a lot of poor people living. The place is pretty run down. It's not well kept. The heat might not work very well. You might have plumbing problems. You might have rats, whatever, right? And the landlords really wouldn't do anything about it. So what SDS would do is they would go into these areas and they would work with people. And the key point of SDS was that the local people there were kind of in charge. SDS people were there to kind of help them and facilitate what they did. And remember the other day I mentioned mutual aid societies. That's kind of what they do today, right? So SDSA would go to a housing project, public housing project, or just some kind of, what we, kind of really bad rundown place. Landlord's not listening to them. It's run down. There's not adequate plumbing. It's maybe drugs, rats, who knows? And the landlord wouldn't do anything about it. So SDS would help these people create tenants unions, right? What's a tenants union? Everybody who lives in that, who's not getting served, who's not getting, calls returned for the problems in their apartments, joins together. Like if one person has a problem and calls the superintendent or the owner and complains about it, and nothing gets done, there's really not a lot you can do. The guy's going to say, pay your rent, and we'll be there next week, or whatever, right? But if everybody gets together collectively, then you have a lot more ability to get something done. And what they would do often is create a bank account called an escrow account. Escrow is money that you put in for later use. So what they would do then is say, on rent day, the first of the month, whatever, they would put the rent money into this escrow account, and they would tell the owner, the landlord, the superintendent, whoever, you're not getting this back until you fix it up. All right. Now, normally we wouldn't, if I said give me an example of democracy, pretty much nobody would come up with something like that. But that's what SDS and that's what the New Left really was stressing, that you have a right to live well, to have this basic right to life, to a decent life, and you have the ability to do something about it. So you create a tenants union, and then, the landlord, either, you can't really kick everybody out at the same time. Or if you did it individually, you said, I'm not paying my rent until you fix it, then you probably not a lot you can do. But if collectively, if everybody there is in this tenants union and you put your rent into escrow instead of giving it to him, then you're a lot more likely to get something done. Okay, so that's one aspect of what participatory democracy is. Another was that SDS would send people out, and generally the women in SDS were really good better organizers actually in many ways than the men were. But they would send groups of people out to work with young women, and especially young women who had children. And so many of them were poor, and they were eligible for benefits, but weren't even aware of it. Prenatal care and child nutrition programs and things like that, food stamps or, it wasn't called WIC at the time, but programs for women to get, formula and diapers and things like that. But it's a bureaucracy. And so a lot of these young women either weren't aware of it, or they would go and look into it and be told that they weren't eligible or something like that. And so what SDS did was send people there to work with them, to help them get through the system, to show them how to fill out the forms, to tell them who to call. If they got turned down, they would help them, figure out who to go to appeal. And in this way, a lot of people got serviced in ways they never would have before. And they thought that was an element of democracy, that the role of the state was just to brush people off and say, you're not eligible, and most people would just give up at that point. But in SDS's mind, in the New Left's mind, it was democratic. That's what democracy meant, that you would work with these people and they would have a voice. They would go to these institutions and these bureaucracies and say, no, that's not true. I'm eligible for these benefits and you have to give them to me, right? And again, we really wouldn't think of that as an element of democracy, but clearly SDS did, and a lot of people participated in programs like that. Another example actually is one that is familiar in 2020, which was police. Police, especially white police in Black communities, and most police forces were basically all white in the 60s, and even those who weren't really all that different. So there was always a great deal of tension and often violence between white police and Black communities. And I pointed that out, that the major crises of the 60s, the major urban rebellions of the 60s in Watts and Detroit and Newark and a lot of other places, just like the Rodney King incident in 92 or George Floyd in 2020, was they got started based on these interactions, these violent interactions with the police, killing or attacking Black motorists or, somebody they arrested, like George Floyd or Eric Garner or Michael Brown or whoever. And so what SDS would do is work with people in those communities to demand that something be done about this. Now, one of the main forms of doing this, which is talked about a little bit today, although today I think they've gone way beyond that, were to create what were called civilian oversight boards. If the police do something, if somebody gets hurt or killed by the police, then generally the police themselves investigate it, right? And so what SDS and the New Left and people who believed in, it's not just SDS and the New Left, it's people who believe in participatory democracy. I mean, that's what sit-ins are. Sit-ins are participatory democracy. That's not saying we're going to wait until you pass a law saying we're allowed to eat at the diner. That's going in and saying we're going to sit here and eat, right? Bus boycotts and all that kind of stuff. The Birmingham boycott, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, those were elements. Those were examples of participatory democracy. It's occurring, and much and actually in many ways much bigger in the civil rights movement. But so these people would, a lot of people from SDS would work with these people in these communities, and they would try to create civilian oversight boards so that if something happened, if there was some kind of violent exchange between the police and the African-American community, then a group of citizens would come in and investigate it, allegedly neutral, who would be more objective, and they would say, okay, you know what, this guy didn't need to beat this guy up, or he didn't need to shoot this guy, or whatever. And it was a way to kind of take that power away from police internal affairs or police unions, who generally, investigate themselves, which is why it's really hard, along with these laws, which kind of give police immunity. It's really hard to get any kind of, penalty or conviction against police, right? And so that's a big element to it. To them, that's an element of democracy. That is participatory democracy, where you have a say, you have a voice in the way your community is policed. All right. And there's I mean, those are three, I think, really kind of easy examples to figure out. There's other stuff. If if the garbage pickup was running late, they might skip a neighborhood, and that neighborhood would generally be a poor neighborhood where the garbage might pile up. So at some point, you might just, find somebody with a pickup truck and throw a bunch of garbage in the back. And if they're not going to come and pick it up at your place, you bring it to them. You might go to City Hall or wherever and just dump all the garbage out and say, hey, you didn't pick this up. You forgot this, right? Stuff like that. The idea is participatory democracy. So you take control of these issues, you act upon them, you have a voice in making the decisions that control your life. You have a role to play. You don't just go vote and let somebody else do it and just sit back and, not do anything from that point onward. You have to participate in it, and democracy doesn't work unless it's participatory. If not, it's just this elite, form of government run by what Wright Mills called the power elite. If you're really into this, Wright Mills actually communicated with the New Left, and there's a document there about it, all right? So this is SDS. These are some of their major projects. Now, SDS also put out a really important statement on this. In 1962, it had a big meeting in this place called Port Huron, Michigan, and it put out the Port Huron statement. And we don't have to read the whole thing, obviously, but I think that the first line is the first couple paragraphs actually are pretty important. We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit, all right? We're people of this generation, or baby boomers, bred in at least modest comfort, middle class, suburbs, they're doing well. They're in universities. I hate to say it, but if you were in a university in the early 60s, and you graduated, you're pretty well set. You'd get a job, you'd be pretty well off. There wasn't really a whole lot of anxiety over that, right? But despite all that, right, they're baby boomers. They've lived well. They're in a university. They're going to get a degree. They'll probably get a job. They're uncomfortable, right? They're uncomfortable about the world. What do they have to be uncomfortable about? He said, when we were kids, the U.S. was the wealthiest and strongest country, the only one with the atomic bomb. The least scarred in World War II. We talked about that, how the U.S. basically escaped the destruction of World War II. The initiator, the creator of the United Nations, freedom and equality, government of, for, and by the people. And so many people began to mature in complacency, right? However, they were awakened by the Southern struggle against racial bigotry, by the Cold War, the atomic bomb, and other things. So what Port Huron said was, we've grown up in this affluence, this privilege, with this sense of complacency, with this comfort, but not everybody's like that. And, we've been seeing that in these Southern civil rights images since the 50s, and even more once the sit-in movement began. And, by 1960, the United States, I think, had 16,000 nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union had like 800 or something like that. So there was an arms race, and there were a lot of political movements to ban the bomb. There's too many nuclear weapons. It's too easy. If you have too many, it's too easy to use them. You might use them mistakenly. We could be spending that money on other things, So there's a ban the bomb movement. And then when Vietnam becomes a big issue, that'll become the anti-war movement too. So the Port Huron statement was, really affected a lot of younger people who were they were living well, but they were kind of like in the 1950s, they kind of saw this conformity, and they saw a lot of people who weren't living well and wanted to do something about it. And so SDS was really critical in that. And then another element of that was much of these movements started on college campuses. So it's people like you, right? They were actually in the classroom, right? And in fact, many of them got started not on these big political issues like civil rights or participatory democracy, although in some regard they were, but on issues regarding university policies. Universities used to have things, and private schools still have them, called parietals, which were the rules for living on campus. Like dorms would close at a certain time, and men and women were not allowed to visit each other in dorms except for certain times. And, obviously you couldn't sleep over. And if the dean caught, people having sex, and then they get suspended. If you went to the clinic on campus, They might report if you had an STD or if you wanted contraceptives. So it's pretty, the idea of campuses was that you take the place of the parents and loco parentis. So these campuses were kind of harsh. And so a lot of the protests actually began over issues like that, extended visitation hours and, availability to contraceptives on campus and things like that. And it morphed into something much bigger, and especially at a place in California, the University of California at Berkeley. Berkeley's still pretty well known as a kind of a liberal campus, although not so much anymore. But at Berkeley, in front of the big administration building, there were every day there were all kinds of tables up there, 40, 50 tables with people passing out political literature. And there were, Democrats and Republicans and people from all kinds of groups, left or right? And at one point, the university put out a new law, a new rule that said you're not allowed to do that anymore. And the students said, the hell with that, we're going to keep doing it. And so they kept doing it, and the police came one day, and the protesters, the students, just kind of took over. They took they stood on top of the police car with a microphone, and they started making speeches. Well, out of this came one of the most famous, speeches of the 1960s by a student at the University of California, Berkeley, named Mario Savio. And again, it's like a lot of this stuff, it's like, what are you rebelling against? Or have you no sense of decency? It doesn't mean that much now. It doesn't hit you now, but at the time it was really, really powerful. And so Mario Savio was talking about how the university was, taking away the rights, treating the students like children, not giving them any rights, not giving them self-determination, not letting them have these kind of political views. And in fact, at one point they were trying to fire the TAs, and they were trying to bring in kind of what you call scab TAs, right? And so Savio gave a speech. I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's quite long. I hopefully have it queued up. And this is where, you can read it there, the famous quote he had, all right? So let me play this.
Sometimes the form of the law is such as to render impossible its effective violation as a method to have it repealed. Sometimes the grievances of people extend to more than just a law, extend to a whole mode of arbitrary power, a whole mode of arbitrary exercise of arbitrary power. And that's what we have here. We have an autocracy which runs this university. It's managed. We were told the following: if President Kerr actually tried to get something more liberal out of the regents in his telephone conversation, why didn't he make some public statement to that effect? And the answer we received from a well-meaning liberal was the following. He said, would you ever imagine the manager of a firm making a statement publicly in opposition to his board of directors? That's the answer. Well, I ask you to consider, if this is a firm, and if the Board of Regents are the Board of Directors, and if President Kerr, in fact, is the manager, then I tell you something, the faculty are a bunch of employees, and we're the raw materials. But we're a bunch of raw materials that don't mean to have any process upon us, don't mean to be made into any product, don't mean to end up being bought by some clients of the university, be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone. We're human beings. And that brings me to the second mode of civil disobedience. There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
That quoted line there became really famous at the time. People were tweeting it out and putting it out. There were all kinds of campus and underground newspapers. Political groups had newspapers, campuses had newspapers, and word of Savio's speech got out, and all of a sudden students all over America were reading this. They read it, And it's very powerful, that the university is kind of dehumanizing them. It's turning them into a number, right? Your PeopleSoft number, right? The university isn't run in any kind of democratic way. Students aren't, given any role in making decisions. Look at, this year you're seeing that with the COVID-19 returns. So what Savio was saying is, you can only take this so much, and there comes a time when you're so sick at heart, you got to put your bodies on the machine and make it stop, right? So that it won't work at all. And this became like a huge, famous rallying cry throughout the decade for student activists, especially. Because now, there's this sense that, of empowerment. We can't just sit around and let all these people tell us what to do because they have authority over us. And so these ideas that, we have to take the control of society through participation, not, by creating more participation, not less, by having more people involved, not just a small number of people. And, especially on college campuses, and the free speech movement blew up and it expanded, it got big. And then, it's working in a lot of people involved in both the SDS and the free speech movement had been involved in the civil rights movement and would be involved in the anti-war movement as well. All right. So all of this stuff is happening. That's why, when I talked at the very beginning about commodification, through these images that we see on commercials or on movies or whatever, you get a particular sense of the 60s. And it's kind of fun, right? Woodstock and hippies and cool music and all that kind of stuff. But there's something else going on in that commodification. By focusing on that nostalgia, he kind of takes the politics out of it. He kind of takes the radicalism out of it. Like I talked about Martin Luther King, right? King has this radical legacy that people don't really know about. And that's really part of the kind of consumer culture, to take those politically radical ideas out, right? And instead turn them into kind of either nostalgia or ways to sell things. And we're seeing that today, with all these corporations, NASCAR and Harley Davidson and the, NFL and all this stuff, or, they support Black Lives Matter and things like that, which I'm not suggesting is a bad thing or it's not genuine. But the point is, it also kind of takes that movement out of a particular political environment and puts it into a safer one. And that's what commodification does. And so the point here is to understand that in the 60s, there's a lot of people who are doing serious stuff. It's not just about the nostalgia. It's not just about Woodstock. It's not just about, wearing long hair or, having tie-dyed shirts or whatever on. So a big part of it is this sense of creating a participatory democracy. A huge part of it, obviously, is the civil rights movement, which you talked about, and probably the others. If there's three kind of elements to the 60s, it would be civil rights, participatory democracy, SDS, and the anti-war movement in Vietnam. There are others we'll talk about too, but those are probably the three, most, significant of that era. The United States didn't send, we talked about this, a few days ago, not in great detail, but the United States didn't have a whole lot of presence, a lot of troops in Vietnam until, later, after Kennedy died. When Kennedy died, there were 16,000. Most Americans weren't really aware of what was going on in Vietnam. It wasn't a huge news item. Most people didn't even know where Vietnam was. It wasn't that big a deal. But after 1964, especially with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, then it became better known. Americans started to hear about Vietnam. The media started covering it more. And in 1964, for the first time, there was a protest against the war. It was organized by SDS, by the Students for the Democratic Society. They started by having what they call teach-ins. And these would be on college campuses where they would have often a professor. I've done tons of teach-ins at UH and Reies and all over, really. And, in the 60s, people from the government would come in and like debate the professors. They won't do that now. I've been trying to get Ted Cruz out, and he just never returns my calls. And they would have these teach-ins and a lot more about Vietnam. And they would have professors come in and talk about, Asian history, because Vietnam is in Southeast Asia. Or they would have people talk about U.S. foreign policy or revolutions or whatever, right? And it started that way. And then in 1964, SDS actually called for people to go to Washington, D.C. to protest the Vietnam War. And they thought a few thousand people would show up. But 25,000 showed up, which really shocked them. It was a big number for them. And that started the anti-war movement. And then, the anti-war movement grew because the war in Vietnam grew. by 1965, there were over 200,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. And then it keeps getting bigger. 1966 is about 350 to 380,000. In 1967, you're getting up in the high 400,000s. And then, by 1968, you have like 540,000. So it's huge. And Vietnam, and this is important, was basically a working class war. The way that selective service, there was a draft, and the way it was set up was that you could get a deferment, and they weren't that hard to get if you knew how. And basically, you get a deferment if you were of a particular class. If your dad knew somebody, or if you had some money, if you were in college, you get a deferment. College students were deferred, by being enrolled in college. You ever see the famous movie Animal House? I don't know if you've ever seen it, but when the guys in Animal House get in trouble, the dean says, and I've all notified your selective service offices that you're eligible for the military draft now, right? So you could, like these politicians do, they have bone spurs or they have flat feet or whatever. So it was fairly easy to get out. So the people left tended to be working class people and, not surprisingly, non-white people. So for instance, the states that had like the most people killed, the biggest percentage of people killed in Vietnam were places like West Virginia, which is really poor, New Mexico, which is Hispanic and Native American, Puerto Rico. So it's a working class war. And even if you had a deferment for going to school, you had a draft card. And that's the thing, like everybody and all the men, if you were in a classroom right now, all the men in their walls would have a selective service card, a draft card. And so one thing that a lot of people did to protest the Vietnam War was this: they burnt their draft cards, right? So you started to see this movement now, in these smaller protests, and then these guys would come out and burn their draft cards. And then they've got bigger. This, for instance, is a huge demonstration at the Pentagon in 1967 with like hundreds of thousands of people. You've all seen the imagery of the Vietnam War. In 1968 in Chicago, at the Democratic Convention, there were these like big protests there where the police just kind of wailed on people. There's a movie out right now on Netflix called The Trial of Chicago 7, which is based on that. It's not the most historically accurate movie, but it's not bad. So you had this real confrontation in American life over the Vietnam War. And, a big part of that was participatory democracy. It goes back to that, what Gene Debs had said, World War I. You have these wars which are started by these old men who have money, these old rich guys, the master class, but they're being fought by the working class. And in Vietnam, they clearly were, even more so because you could find a way out if you knew somebody, if you had some connections or whatever. Or and there's a folk singer, a name I've mentioned before, Phil Oakes, and he wrote kind of a satirical little song about it. It's short, so I'm gonna play that, which kind of gives you some idea of what kind of things could be done to get out of the draft.
Oh, I'm just a typical American boy from a typical American town. I believe in God and Senator Dodd, and I keep an old Castro down. And when it came my time to serve, I knew better dead than red. But when I got to my old draft board, buddy, this is what I said. Sarge, I'm only 18, I got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I've got eyes like a bat and my feet are flat and my asthma's getting worse. Yes, think of my career, my sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm a-going to school and I'm a-working in a defense plant. I got a dislocated disc and a racked up back, I'm allergic to flowers and bugs. And when the bombshell hits, I get epileptic fits and I'm addicted to 1,000 drugs. I got the weakness woes, I can't touch my toes, I can hardly reach my knees. And if the enemy came close to me, oh, I'd probably start to sneeze. I'm only 18, got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I've got eyes like a bat, and my feet are flat, and my asthma's getting worse. Yes, think of my career, my sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm a-going to school, and I'm a-working in a defense plant. Ooh, I hate show and lie, and I hope he dies. But one thing you gotta see, that someone's gotta go over there, and that someone isn't me. So I wish you well, Sarge, give him hell. Kill me 1,000 or so. And if you ever get a war without blood and gore, I'll be the first to go. Yes, I'm only 18, I got a ruptured spleen and I always carry a purse. I've got eyes like a bat and my feet are flat and my asthma's getting worse. Yes, think of my career, my sweetheart dear, my poor old invalid aunt. Besides, I ain't no fool, I'm a-going to school and I'm working in a defense plant.
All right. Really famous song by Phil Oakes about ways to get out of the draft, right? So all of these things together, the Antiwar movement's really crucial in this, create this real sense throughout the country, especially among young people, that America has to change, right? The civil rights movement is attacking the apartheid system in the South. And then, this idea that, we are people of this generation bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, but looking at uncomfortably at the world we're about to inherit, and they try to create this system of participation, a democratic system in which people actually have a role to play. And then, once the war gets bigger, you have people going out into the streets in huge numbers. First students, and then it becomes even bigger than that. And you start to have kind of just typical citizens getting involved in it too. And so you can, imagine the ruling class is kind of flipping. The Southern ruling class can't handle the idea that, Martin Luther King and this civil rights movement is in the streets. They're boycotting. They're involved in this, kind of a nonviolent but militant resistance, and that, it's being shown all over television screens and in newspapers all over the world. Participatory democracy is challenging the very nature of, who gets to run society. So, in a lot of places I mentioned how they would form tenants unions. Well, some of these big, huge housing projects, which were really run down, were often owned by people who were, maybe on city council or really close to the mayor. The mayor may have invested in it. And so when SDS and the people there started tenants unions to withhold their rent and put it in escrow, they were attacking, the local class of leadership in those communities. So it's a big deal. So when these things are going on, they're not just kind of, occurring in isolation. There's something bigger going on where all of these people, civil rights, SDS, and there'll be more to the Antiwar movement, are basically saying the United States is just being run in wrong, is being run badly. It's in some ways it's dysfunctional and it's not democratic, right? And we've heard this in 2020. So kind of in sometimes the more things change, right? So those are the big ones, but there's other stuff going on too. And I want to talk about that, a little bit because, like I said, I could, spend a long time on the 60s, but, you can't do that. So, so the civil rights movement was really critical because I think it creates this model. It gives this kind of, it's inspirational. And a lot of people see that, and they see the way that these, young people, especially in SNCC and Martin Luther King and the people following him, the people of Montgomery and Boycott and Birmingham, took on the system, and it's kind of inspirational, and it kind of also gives them a model for their own groups, because there's a lot of groups in the United States, maybe who aren't in the same predicament that Southern blacks are, but who aren't, exactly, integrated into American society either. And they're going to do something about it too. So a few I'm going to talk about. The first is the Chicano movement. There was PBS did a special on that too.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire.
All right.
Coming up next on Chicano, the history of the Mexican-American civil rights movement. In
All right, I just put that up there to give you, let you know that it's there. It's a PBS special on Chicano history too. Actually, the book that came out with it was published at the Arte Publico at UH. The Chicano movement has a couple elements to it. One is involved with labor. It's involved with especially migrant workers in agriculture. And the most famous person in that is Cesar Chavez, a name you're surely familiar with. And if you watch that Chicano movement, it's like 20 minutes long. They'll talk about Chavez in there for sure. And agricultural workers in today really always have been, had some of the most, horrific working conditions. They're working in like really brutal heat. and they're not paid well. They often don't have bathrooms in the field. They're often given, just like a couple water breaks a day. They're exposed, especially worse than that, to all kinds of pesticides and carcinogenic stuff that they're using in the fields. So it's a really, really rough job. And so Chavez and others, and in places like the Valley of Texas or in California, you have a significant number of Mexican Americans who are doing this. Some who are seasonal workers. They come across, or the Bracero program it was called. So you could come across and be a seasonal worker. And in California, I think there were actually even more Filipino workers in agriculture than there were Mexicans. So you have in all of these southwestern states, California and Arizona and New Mexico and Texas, places like that. And so what they wanted to do was organize a union. And it would become the United Farm Workers Union, the UFW. And this is just a picture of a UFW picture there, right? It says, support Cesar Chavez and the international boycott, don't buy grapes. So what the farm workers did, they wanted the operators, the people, the big people who owned these agricultural these are like plantations. They're big corporations and they pick lettuce, they pick grapes. They're in the wine fields. People like Ernest and Julio Gallo, and they hire migrant labor there. So what they did was they used a couple strategies. One was La Huelga, the strike, just go on strike. Now, these are poor workers, right, who don't have a whole lot of power, but they do have one advantage in that, agricultural work and agricultural production is on a time clock in ways that like industrial manufacturing in the North isn't. If you go on strike, you can, making steel, you can go back and finish the steel, right? But if you're picking lettuce, or if you're picking strawberries and you quit, then that stuff's going to spoil and it's not going to go to market. So they began by having these strikes, and then they created a national boycott movement. So they asked people all over the United States not to buy agricultural production from certain farms. And so people would go into these stores and they would specifically tell the people on it, we're not going to buy it because of the boycott. And so this finally created, they forced these farm operators to recognize the United Farm Workers Union and Chavez, right? So that's part of it. But Chavez himself I don't think ever called himself a Chicano. Chicano implied something else, and that was more of a movement for younger people. It's kind of the other part of this, the second part of it, right? A lot of younger Mexican Americans began embracing their roots both as kind of Mexican or even Spanish, but also as Indians, as natives. So they came to the Chicano movement. Chicano movement it's younger, it's more militant. It kind of looks a bit like SNCC or the Black Panthers in some regards, right? And one of their key themes was La Raza Unida, the people united. And they even formed political parties starting in Texas called La Raza Unida. I think the first one was in southern Texas, and if I'm not mistaken, it started because there was a school that was, it's kind of like the free speech movement on campuses, campus rules. Well, in this particular case, it's not often the biggest thing that creates a movement. In maybe Crystal City, I think I should have looked it up to be sure before that. But there was a school that was majority Mexican American, but like all the cheerleaders and the student council were white kids. And so the parents, were upset about that. So they put together a political party to run for the school board, La Raza Unida, and they won. They took over the school board, right? And so you start to see these movements occur in New Mexico and Arizona and the Valley, South Texas, places like that. And it's kind of a big deal. So you have this more kind of a radical element to it as well. Now, even better known, well, not better known than Chavez. No one in the movement is better known than Chavez, but even more militant than Chavez and somebody who kind of becomes a hero was a guy named Reies Tijerina. Now, there are, like I said, there are these kind of people who kind of get their model from like SNCC and Black Panthers, and that's what Tijerina was kind of compared to that, although his issue was very unique. Tijerina founded La Alianza Federal de Mercedes, the Federal Alliance of Land Grants. I'm not going to go back and talk about international law, but after the Mexican-American War, there were people who had grants of land in what used to be Mexico that had been given to them by the Spanish, long time ago. And those grants were still, they claim, were legally binding. And so Tijerina and a lot of other younger Chicanos wanted to reclaim that land, right? And so they created the La Alianza in 1963, and they wanted to return these Spanish land grants to their original owners. And their slogan was Tierra o Muerte, or land or die, right? So they organized like SNCC, they organized direct actions. They would have sit downs and protests. They became more, kind of militant. And in New Mexico in 1965, a group of members raided a courthouse in Rio Arriba County, and they took it over. So this is a really famous, scene. It was all over the news in 1967, and it turned violent. Shots rang out. 2 officers were shot. I think a deputy and maybe a reporter were taken hostage. I think one of the officers later died from the wounds. The people from the Alianza fled. Tijerina was arrested. 47 members from the National Guard and Taos were sent to Rio Arriba County. So it's a huge national issue, right? This issue of land. And this wasn't just, this is going on in New Mexico. It was probably the most, best known, but there was one in a movement in Colorado by the name of Jorge Gonzalez. There are movements in Texas. So there's this more militant group. This is participatory democracy as they see it, right? This is our land and we're reclaiming it. And, the state used violence to repress it. Chicanos also had their own kind of version of the Panthers, the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets more started as a group initially to deal with police brutality against people in their own communities. So you have, African Americans and police tend to be the biggest story historically too, the civil rights movement onward. But there are, significant problems in Latino communities and Native American communities actually have a higher rate of people getting shot and killed by police than African American communities do. Even so, what the Brown Berets got started as a more militant faction. Chavez was a labor leader, and so he would go on strike or have boycotts, but he wasn't really involved in, it was Martin Luther King went to California to march with him and things like that, but Chavez wasn't a militant, he wasn't a radical, he was actually kind of very conservative culturally, he was a devout Catholic, and he had some issues. He and the young Chicanos didn't, just like the Black Panthers and Martin Luther King didn't get along all that great, either. So Tijerina and the Brown Berets represent another kind of element in the Chicano movement of that period. The Brown Berets formed to, go after the police, to do something about police brutality, to protect farm workers. That's a big part of it. They were part of the land grant movement. And they also were opposed to the Vietnam War. The Brown Berets were part of a group, the first group called the Rainbow Coalition in the 1960s, a group of like the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, SDS, white radicals got together and they called it the Rainbow, right? To get all the colors together to work as a this movement against the state, against the repressive state. So they were part of that as well. See something here. The Brown Berets were also involved in the Vietnam anti-war movement. In 1970, they sponsored the Chicano moratorium, which was one of the biggest anti-war protests at the time, over 20,000 people in Los Angeles, led by the Brown Berets and other Chicano groups, turned violent. The police fired a well-known journalist, Ruben Salazar, was killed. So the Chicano movement, doesn't get as much attention, isn't as well known as, for instance, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. It's really critical in that period and gives rise to a lot of the organizations and movements that have taken shape since then, right? Another really well-known and critical and important movement was the movement for women, women's liberation movement especially. I think I briefly mentioned this the other day, but during the Civil Rights Act in 1964, during the debate on the Civil Rights Act, a representative from Virginia, I didn't go into the detail about it, but a representative from Virginia, when it said the law said you were not allowed to discriminate based on color, right? So it's a law for African Americans, right? this guy from Virginia thought, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to monkey wrench this thing. So I'm going to say, I'm going to add the word sex. So it's like you were not allowed to discriminate based on color or sex. He figured if you put that in, that people would vote against it because they wouldn't support that. Well, it didn't work. And so the 1964 Civil Rights Act actually covered women as well as people who were being discriminated against based on, skin color or ethnicity. So the women's movement was kind of the first phase of that. Now, that tended to be a movement that dealt with legal issues, women getting jobs, women getting equal pay, who did the exact same jobs. Into the 1960s, women could be paid less. There were no laws demanding equal pay for equal work. You do the same job. You could be teachers, you could be nurses, you could be in the exact same thing, doing the exact same job, exact same workplace, doing the exact same work, and be paid much differently. Women could not get credit cards. Women could not get loans for their houses. Legally, women were really in this secondary subordinate position. So the first phase of this is the women's movement, which deals with these legal issues like equal pay for equal work and, access to, credit and things like that. The women's liberation movement came after that. And that, like the kind of Chicano, it's like in all these things, you have this kind of establishment movement, the early civil rights movement or Cesar Chavez or the women's movement. And then you have kind of this more militant movement that comes after it. The women's movement tended to be more middle class and more kind of less young women, right? One of the key people in that was Betty Friedan, a writer who in 1963 wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, which was a bestseller. And in it, she just talked of kind of how, women would go to college, they'd be educated, and then they'd go home and they would be forced, to just stay at home and clean and do all that kind of stuff. So they gave up their careers. And there was this sense of kind of disillusion and everything else around it. So this is part of the women's movement. Well, younger women were active at the time in like the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam movement. And they were starting to kind of get their own sense of disillusionment too, because they're working with people who are, supposed to be fighting for civil rights, ending the war. But in those institutions, the men treated the women pretty much the same as men were treating women in corporate America, right? They would make the coffee, do the Xeroxing, stuff like that. So what you had then was this break away from, a lot of these mainstream liberal organizations and this kind of older, more established form of protest in the women's movement to women's liberation. Liberation meant to kind of break and actually demand, demand equal, same thing. I mean, demand equal pay, demand access to jobs, demand access to law schools, demand access to medical schools. I think now majority of med and law students are both female in America, but that clearly wasn't the case in the 1960s. And so the women's liberation was a part of that. The women's liberation became famous in 1968. That's kind of when Americans took notice because they went to the symbol of women's role in America, the Miss America pageant. I don't even know if it's around anymore. I think Trump owned it for a while, didn't he? But in 1968, women went to the Miss America pageant to protest, and obviously got a lot of attention because Miss America pageant was a big deal back then. And they set this up. It was called the Freedom Trash Can. And in it, they threw symbols of women's oppression. They threw away like Playboy magazines and, stuff like that showed what their role in society was, their unequal role in society was. This was a very famous poster, Welcome to the Miss American Cattle Call, where they had a woman who was a model. Well, I forget her name, but pretty well-known model at the time, who did a picture as if she were, like a side of beef or something like that, to kind of, again, show how women were being dehumanized in society. Here's a little video on it. I'm only going to show a bit of it. There wasn't a whole lot of, there was one I used to have that was really good. It was kind of the way the media portrayed women in the women's lib movement. And it was just like really crazy how, you can imagine how patronizing and condescending they are. I couldn't find that one. I don't know if it's like, whatever, but so this is just a little kind of a little review of various news articles. And the first one there, that's Betty Friedan, right?
Betty Friedan is among the delegates to the Democratic Convention. Representative Bella Abzug of New York also attends, along with a leading spokeswoman of the women's lib movement, Gloria Steinem. Youngest delegate is Julie Price of Bartlesville, Oklahoma, seen here with Speaker Carl Albert of the House of Representatives. Julie, age 18, was one of the first girl pages to serve in the United States Senate. History is made when Shirley Chisholm, first black woman elected to the House, becomes the first black woman nominated to run for president. Miss Chisholm receives more than 100 votes.
The publication in 1963 of Betty Friedan's bestseller, The Feminine Mystique, caused women to re-examine traditional roles and to protest old stereotypes. During the Miss America pageant in 1968, women conducted demonstrations on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. Demanding freedom from the bondage of male chauvinism, many women began to seek professional careers. This emerging consciousness would soon be known as women's liberation. The times were changing.
All right. Women's liberation was different than the women's movement. It was far more activist, far more radical. It talked about issues like careers and jobs, but it also brought to the bigger issues in it. In the short term, the first was probably abortion rights. Abortion laws were based on state to state. Each state could have its own laws. And so in many states, it was prohibited. So women, if they had, if they had access to some money or something like that, might, if they were in like Texas where it was prohibited, go to New York. I had a friend who used to drive cabs way back when, and he said he used to often do that. He'd go to the airport in New York and pick up a woman from Texas, and then she'd give him an address and say, wait here. And then 2-3 hours later, she'd come out and he'd take her back to the airport. So that was kind of the way it was done. And so the women's liberation movement made a point of priority for contraceptive rights and abortion rights. The Supreme Court until 1963 didn't say that there was a right to contraception. Even that was 1963. The last states had banned even that. So, and this culminated obviously with Roe v. Wade in 1973. So that became a big element of the women's liberation movement, abortion rights, daycare for kids, having, kind of preschool programs for kids was a big part of that. You started to see gay and lesbian rights be kind of part of that, but not quite as much as it would be later. So women's liberation is clearly a big element of that as well. First in this kind of more established way, jobs and federal jobs and things like that. Then in these kind of other ways like that are more kind of cultural as well as political, with the Freedom Trash Can, the protests, abortion rights, gay and lesbian rights, things like that. All right. Now the part that everybody really digs about the 60s is the counterculture and, the kind of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll part of it. Right. And so I'll do, probably not going to do all this because there's a lot there and, there's just too much. And, there's a lot of songs and videos up here. I'm not going to play them all. So you can do those, when you're watching this. Cause it's, as I go back to the Springsteen line, I learned more from a 3-minute record than I ever learned in school. You can learn a lot from this stuff, probably more than me just going on and on and on about it. But the one of the key elements when you talk about the 60s is the music, right? People often bring out the protest music, and probably the most famous was Bob Dylan, who's still around, still performing, still traveling, won a Nobel Prize in literature not that long ago. Just an amazing artist, written some of the most famous songs in American history. And everybody always kind of brings him up when you talk about the 60s. People talk about the Beatles too, what the Beatles were writing, like kind of bubblegum music, like She Loves You, Yeah, 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 stuff like that. But Dylan is writing songs that are very serious about society, about race, about war, things like that. And one of his most famous is
Let's do this thing. I started playing the guitar because of my need to communicate. And after all this time, I still feel that need to talk to you. Great work, gents.
Society in the early 60s.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. Or the times they are a-changing. Some writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming was the loser, now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing. Senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. The battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changing.
This is one of the most famous songs really in rock and roll, culture. And this album came out, I think, in late 1963, early 1964. But it's not just this song, which became kind of almost like an anthem for the 1960s. The times they are changing. It's basically saying these old people don't understand it. They don't get it. Things are changing. But the first song, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, is about a black woman in Baltimore who worked, kind of as a servant almost at this plantation house in Maryland. And the young white guy who worked there beat her to death with a cane. With God on Our Side is about war and how everybody goes to war. Every country goes to war saying God is on our side. God wants us to win. We're the greatest country because God wants us that way. And only upon in their game, he wrote in 1963, when King gave the I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington, just a bit before that, Bob Dylan came out and for the first time sang this song along with Joan Baez, who very famous singer in her own right. I think they were together as a couple at the time too. Only Upon in Their Game is about Medgar Evers, who was the head of the Mississippi NAACP. He was assassinated by white supremacists in 1963. So Dylan really kind of politicized music in ways that only Woody Guthrie had done before. Dylan actually, Woody Guthrie was very sick at the end of his life. Dylan went to New York to visit Guthrie in the hospital, spent a lot of time with him. So, if in the history of kind of American popular music, people who had an impact beyond just music into, kind of politics and society would, I think Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan would definitely be the two biggest, the two best known, right? And so whenever you talk about the 60s protest music, you got to talk about Dylan. After that, you could talk about a million different things. I'm going to go out with the Stones just because it's a song I like, and that's one cool thing about being a professor, right? You can do stuff like that, right? But there are 60s protest music. There's a ton of stuff on it. There's a ton of stuff written about it. There's all kinds of playlists. So if you're into that, it's easy to find. And, obviously if you want any recommendations or anything like that, let me know. But we're going to go out with the Stones. Now, much of the 60s is about, there's this tension between how to protest and, what American democracy really is. Should it be confrontational? Should it be violent? Should it be passive? Should it be participatory? Should it be representative? And so the Stones, this song, which is called Street Fight Man, kind of has it's about that.
Women are like flowers.
Hola!
You are so full of it.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
On the Rocks with Dar.
Summer's here and the time is right.
And that was one of the big kind of questions, confrontations of the 60s. The time is right for palace revolution, but where I'm from, the game to play is compromise solution. And so there's this tension. And there are people in Black Panthers, in the Brown Berets, in SDS, like Abbie Hoffman, well-known radical, who are calling for a revolution. And popular culture and protest music reflects that. So there's a lot more to talk about. We'll do that next time. We're through 20 of them. We're close. We don't have that much left. So hope you're doing all the reading, and hope you're enjoying this as much as possible. Like I said, it's a unique situation, but we're doing the best we can. So stay in touch. Check Blackboard and all the normal stuff. Wear your masks. Be careful, and we will see you next time.